reminders, good old Zoom etiquette. Please keep yourself muted during the program. The mute button, it looks like a little microphone. It can be at the bottom, or I have mine at the top of my screen. If it does not have a red line through it, that means you're not muted and we can hear your dog barking and you eating those chips. So to mute it, you just click on it with your cursor and you'll see the red line and you'll be muted. Also, you're able to see me because I have my live video going. But if you go to the little camera icon, when it says stop video, if you'd rather have someone see just your name or another picture you have there instead, you can click that. We will let you know when we're ready for questions from the attendees. But in the meantime, please use the chat box to share. Let's see. Could be. There we go. There's that mute button I was talking about. Use the chat button, the chat box, to share your comments and any questions. You simply click on the chat icon and get the chat box to come up and then write your questions, and we'll have someone monitoring that. We are using the Zoom's closed captioning service as well. So if you would like to use that option, the icon CC is at the bottom of your screen and you can click on that. So that you will see the person speaking on your screen, you may need to adjust your view. You can do this on the top right of your screen. If it says speaker view, you click on it and then your screen will look as it does here down below. If it says gallery view, you don't need to do anything. Again, if you're having difficulty, note that in the chat and one of our league members will help you. Thank you for your attention and your interest in redistricting. And now we're going to have some comments by our League of Women Voters of Kansas co-presidents.
Thank you, Teresa, and good evening, everybody. I am Jackie Lightcap. I'm co-president of the League of Women Voters of Kansas. Welcome to the Kansans Deserve Fair Maps, People-Powered Fair Maps Day of Action event. We have a very long title there, but that's because of all the information packed here. This is the second year of the campaign, which was launched in September 2019 to support the creation of fair and transparent, people-powered redistricting processes that eliminate partisan and racial gerrymandering nationwide. The focus of the first year was achieving a complete count of the population in the decennial census.
Good evening, everyone. I am Martha Pint, co-president of the League of Women Voters of Kansas. Our moderator tonight is Dr. Michael Smith, chair of the Political Science Department at Emporia State University. Welcome, Dr. Smith. Based on his extensive knowledge of the history and processes of redistricting, Dr. Smith is often called upon to speak on the topic. As mentioned earlier, we will have time at the end for the audience to ask questions. So please submit your questions in the chat box, indicating to whom each should be directed. Dr. Smith will then ask the questions of the panelists on your behalf.
Let me begin the introductions with Representative Stephanie Clayton, who represents House District 19 in Johnson County. Representative Clayton has served in the Kansas House of Representatives since 2013, first as a Republican and currently as a Democrat. One of her stated goals is, quote, to serve as a bridge between parties, helping the legislature and state find common sense bipartisan solutions to issues we face. Representative Clayton is a past ranking minority member of the House Education Committee and the current minority whip and ranking minority member of the Commerce, Labor, and Economic Development Committee. Regarding any attempt at voter suppression, Representative Clayton says, if you are trying to make voting harder, you are probably the bad guy. Listening to her constituents has always been a priority. She hosts monthly town hall meetings and communicates regularly through social media.
Our other esteemed panelist is former Senator Tim Owens. Senator Owens, a Vietnam veteran who served in the United States Army, was elected to and served on the Overland Park City Council for 24 years. He was elected to the Kansas House of Representatives in 2002 and to the Senate in 2008, where he was known as an outspoken liberal Republican. He lost his bid for re-election in 2012 and has remained active in state and local politics. Senator Owens was co-chair of the Kansas Legislature's Special Committee on Redistricting in 2011 and brings valuable firsthand knowledge of and insight to the process of redistricting in Kansas. During the 2012 legislative session, the legislature did not successfully pass redistricting bills, and the district maps were ultimately drawn by the U.S. District Court for Kansas. Senator Owens recalls being on the witness stand for 3 hours during the court's proceeding. Senator Owens has been a member of the League of Women Voters of Johnson County for many years. Welcome.
Before we begin our dialogue, we will hear from Teresa Briggs. You heard from her at the beginning. Teresa is our League of Women Voters of Kansas People-Powered Fair Maps Coordinator.
Thank you both, Jackie and Martha. I am proud to work alongside a talented group of Kansas League members who are contributing their skills to develop tools for communicating with policymakers, educating the public, and advocating for those marginalized groups whose interests are not always taken into consideration. Members of our Kansas People-Powered Fair Maps work group come from 5 of our 9 local leagues and represent hundreds of league members. If you have your video on, you can wave, ladies. Our work group is preparing public education material and encouraging Kansans to begin now talking to their legislators about redistricting. We have a product of our work here to show you. Didn't do that right, did I? Was that probably wasn't.
You just want to share your screen first, Teresa.
Right, got it. Just when you think you got me trained.
Every 10 years, voting districts are redrawn based on census population data. In Kansas, we expect the legislature to complete redistricting in spring 2022 after they receive the certified data in late summer or fall 2021. Gerrymandering is when elected officials manipulate districts to create an unfair political advantage. They use tactics called packing or cracking. Packing is when officials concentrate one party together to reduce their voting power in other districts. Cracking is diluting a party's voting power across many districts. These packed and cracked districts come in various shapes and sizes and can look quite odd. The word gerrymander comes from this odd salamander-shaped district in Massachusetts in 1812. It was signed by then-Governor Elbridge Gerry to give his party an advantage over his rivals. Gerrymandering continues to this day. The result is a lack of fair representation because lawmakers choose their voters instead of voters choosing their elected officials. The time is now to change the process of how voting districts are drawn. It's time for voters to play a greater role in the process. It's time for people-powered fair maps. The League of Women Voters wants to see an independent, nonpartisan committee draw voting districts that include numerous opportunities for public input. Contact your state senator and state representative to let them know you want an independent commission to draw the voting districts. Let's give the power back to the people with people-powered fair maps.
Alrighty, a moment and I'll get back to where I was at. I think. All right. Currently, only members of the House Redistricting Committee have been appointed. Anyone can communicate with these members, but every lawmaker will be involved in the process. So even if yours is not on the committee, please go ahead and educate them. The League cannot be the only voice advocating for change in the process of redistricting. It is important that each person attending tonight takes action as well by educating your friends and neighbors, regularly communicating with elected officials, and actively participating in public hearings and meetings about redistricting. If you belong to an organization with an interest in public policy, better transportation systems, better healthcare, better schools, better policing and justice systems, your partners in that work also have a stake in redistricting. Encourage them to get involved. What you're looking at on the screen are the elements of a fair redistricting process that we want Kansas policymakers to support. The League is in this for the long haul. Our ultimate goals include creation of an independent, nonpartisan redistricting commission. But for now, we have our work cut out for us, doing everything we can to come out of the 2022 session with fair maps. At this time, I will turn the program over to our moderator, Dr. Michael Smith, who will pose the questions to our panelists.
Good evening, everybody. This is just a great event, and I'm just impressed with everything that's happened in the opening comments and videos and so forth. And I won't take up too much time because we want to maximize the amount of time that our panelists get to talk and that you get to ask your questions. And again, just a reminder, we do ask that you type your questions into the chat box. Some of you may have what's called a floating toolbar where you have to hover your mouse over it for it to pop up, probably at the bottom of your screen. And then there should be a link for chat. And then we'll monitor that, and then we'll ask those questions as time is available. We have several questions drafted by the work group, which we will begin with. I will direct them to the panel as a group rather than to individual members of the panel, and let the panelists decide how they would like to answer them, in what order, and so forth. And we're not using any strict time limits, but I'll just kind of keep an eye on time. And if things start to run just a little bit long, I'll do a gentle intervention just to make sure we have a little time for your questions at the end. All right, let's do this. The very first question that the work group has submitted, panelists, is as follows. What are your thoughts on a nonpartisan redistricting commission?
I don't know how we do this to see who goes first or not, so.
You go right ahead.
All right. Well, I am a strong supporter of a nonpartisan redistricting commission. We've seen, I've seen bills, or rather, this would require constitutional change that have been introduced, and I support every single one of them. But I don't believe that we have even had a hearing on one in the Kansas legislature. I think we have a lot of different ideas about what constitutes the gold standard. I think we hear a lot about Iowa's redistricting commission and how a lot of people like this, but I'm also hearing, I've been involved with the Brennan Center for Justice in regards to a lot of redistricting policy and just voter enfranchisement policy. And they tend to like the Ohio model. And even still, I'll see other folks who like the California model. Suffice to say, I do think we need some sort of backup, because legislators, while we are put in place to govern on behalf of our constituents, we are not perfect. We do come into this with bias. And so a nonpartisan redistricting commission, I think, helps to alleviate this bias. It doesn't eliminate it entirely, but it does make things better.
Well, that's a good segue into what I was going to respond to, and I certainly respect Representative Clayton, is always very well prepared whenever I've seen her speaking. My answer to this question is a qualified yes. in support of a nonpartisan commission. However, that qualification is this, and we've had this discussion before. We had it 10 years ago when I chaired the committee. The qualification is, how do you avoid political bias? You may have political bias in the legislature. Obviously you do. But if you were to appoint a commission, who appoints them? And those people that are appointing are probably going to have a certain element of political bias. So that's the, you know, that's the difficult part of this. If you have a bias already in the commission, then do you really have a nonpartisan, unbiased commission? And I think that's the real hurdle that you have to get over.
Pardon me. Did we ever know that the phrase "you're muted" would become such a part of the English language before the pandemic? That was great. It's two different perspectives, but presented civilly. Wish we could see more of that in American and Kansas politics these days. The second question presented by the work group is, what process changes would you like to see implemented in the 2022 round of redistricting? It's a two-part question. The second part is, what argument would you make to your colleagues in support of those changes?
Well, I'm not sure that I would advocate for a major change in policy. You're going to have to have each house making a determination on how to address the maps for their houses. I'm talking directly about the state House of Representatives and the Senate. There's an argument that can be made that when you talk about the congressional maps, and that's a broader subject, but I think that what we ran into was we had a commission or a committee from each house, and they met independently and drew maps. This was 10 years ago. And that was all right until you started seeing the maps, and then you started having the Senate maybe not liking what the House drew, or the House not liking what the Senate drew, and having that kind of a conflict between the two. So it became a difficult issue having two separate commissions or committees doing the same work on their area, but also kind of taking a look at the other house. If there was some way that you could have both houses coming together at the beginning and then meeting together and have those meetings held together, I think it would be advantageous, but I'm not sure you'll get there with two different houses and two different leaderships.
I definitely am going to agree with Senator Owens on this. I think that, again, one of the biggest changes that I would like to see is just more agreeing. Now, and I realize that, of course, this sounds like a fairy tale, but having talked to some of my colleagues that have been through not the redistricting process a decade ago, but 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, and some of the stories that they tell me include, you know, people from different parties and different areas really agreeing on the maps and working together to hammer them out. That is certainly something that I hope to see, but I have to admit that I am, I want to say cautiously optimistic, but reasonably cynical, at least regarding the makeup of the House committee, sort of a hope for the best, but expect the worst kind of situation. So, you know, ideally, obviously, I will be working with my Johnson County colleagues on my side of the aisle on what we believe to be a fair map, and that will be discussed further this evening, so I won't go into that now. But again, I think that collaboration and going into this with the understanding that this is not about us, this is about our constituents. So if we start with that attitude, then I think that that's a good way to move forward.
All right, thank you. Speaking of constituent involvement, that's what question number 3 asks about. The working group would like to know, what type of information from constituents is the most helpful during redistricting?
Well, my response to that was first, and we met with a lot of people around the state. We had different meetings all across the state. I think there were 14 of them, as I recall. And the question that I would ask is, should there be a change in any given district? I would want to hear that from the constituents. Should you have a change? Maybe they don't think so. But if the answer is yes, then I would want to know why. And you have these different constituent groups, different interest groups. And as I recall from the meetings that we had across the state, the people that attended those were quite willing to say why. And there was a lot of differences of opinion as to how they felt or why they would do it. But I think that's really what I want to hear from the constituents. I want to know, do you want to change? And if so, why?
Now, we have, as of yet, to have any meetings scheduled. I sincerely hope that we have meetings across the state. And while I like Zoom, I'm fully vaccinated. I feel like we should be traveling to these communities so that we can get a real idea. And especially too, to make it more open to people where they're more comfortable to participate. Because a lot of our communities of interest don't necessarily have access to technology such as Zoom, to technology such as solid broadband. We do have some language barriers there, so I think interpretation would be very important to have that as an option. And, also I think a lot of people who, not everyone is working an 8 to 5 schedule where they can hop on an evening Zoom. So I really hope to see a diverse and accessible series of meetings that are set up from varying constituents. Now, those of you on this Zoom tonight who are my constituents, you know that I try to be as accessible as I possibly can. And I do like to hear your opinions and like to have that dialogue. But as a member of the redistricting, looking at how we put those really good maps together, there are communities that I am paying especially close attention to. Obviously, the Johnson County area, where we obviously will be picking up seats due to our increased population, but also some of the larger small cities that we have in the state. So I'm thinking Dodge City, Hutchinson, Salina, some of those areas that do have increased population and also have what I believe might possibly be potentially disenfranchised Latinx and other immigrant communities, people who may or may not be eligible to vote, but still deserve that representation. So looking at that, that's going to be number one, really kind of at the back of my mind behind Johnson County's maps, which of course are my top priority.
I really agree that I think it's better to be face to face, and maybe that's indicative of my generation. This is new. I mean, frankly, this is my first Zoom meeting. But I think that it really does a lot of good to actually physically be there in the community that you're really talking about and in the area you're talking about, because you do get a real sense about who they are, who are the people we're talking about are going to affect. And so I do think, I agree with that. I think it's better to be person to person. This type of approach gives access to a lot of people that might not otherwise travel to the locations of the meetings. So maybe some way to do a combination of the two would be good to have available so people can look in and see what's going on. But actually, the people in the committee or on the committee should be able to see and feel where they're really addressing.
All right, maybe the Kansas legislators redistricting committees are coming soon to a location near you. Question number 4 asks about communities of interest. Now, Senator Owens, Representative Clayton, I know you know what these things are, but just for the folks listening in tonight, communities of interest is a concept that refers to places which it might not be in the best interest to split across multiple districts. It could be a county, it could be a city, it could be a school district, it could be 2 adjoining cities that have a lot in common. but that's often an issue in redistricting that these communities don't want to be split. I might add that, as some of you probably know, there are rumors, and there are nothing but rumors at this point, but rumors that Johnson County, which may be conceptualized as a community of interest, may be split across multiple congressional districts for the first time in known Kansas history in the next round of redistricting. So that's the premise. Now here's the question. What framework did or will you use to balance competing communities of interest as you evaluate different configurations of districts?
All right, well, Senator, I'll go ahead and hop in here. One of the first things that I think about is, things that, Johnson County itself is fairly balkanized, and it's kind of difficult to explain to my colleagues who are not from Johnson County the way that these varying potential communities of interest are set up. For instance, prior to the current maps that we have now, the maps prior used to be sort of long, skinny, and vertical. So the legislative district that I used to live in started at 87th Street, and it was almost, it was basically between Metcalf and Knoll, and it went all the way down to, I think, 133rd. And so it didn't make a lot of sense to me, although I could understand it for political reasons, because you had sort of a more moderate northern area that was Shawnee Mission School District inside the 435 loop being joined with sort of a, less engaged, more conservative area south of the 435 loop. I think that we can definitely say inside the loop Johnson County versus outside the loop Johnson County. These are different groups of people who have different values. Yes, we have some things that are similar, but I still think that if you start seeing any sort of districts that are really horizontal or really vertical, trying to combine inside and outside the loop, that is going to give me cause for concern. So anyone who's on here wanting to draw a map, I'm watching for that, and I'm not buying it. I think also when we think about communities of interest, we obviously think about racial communities. We think about sort of cultural urban core communities, right? So that may have been, areas that used to be settled by certain immigrant groups and now have sort of changed a little bit, but still have that in mind. We also think about areas too, where you have different social classes, again, different school districts. So we've got a lot of different possibilities here, and it isn't as cut and dried as we would normally think. So that's why it's so important for our committee to really do a lot of listening instead of talking, because there's a lot of information about these communities that we need to be taking in.
Well, I think it's important to note, I agree with what you just said. We both come from Johnson County, and that's always been a little bit of an issue when you're in the legislature. People ask, well, where are you from? Well, I'm from Johnson County. Oh, you're from one of those. Well, yeah, but if you take Johnson County and you turned it about 90 degrees, I think you'd find that Johnson County is very much like the state as a whole in the way that it is set up. The southern part of Johnson County is more conservative. The northern part is more moderate, or if you want to use the old term, liberal. I guess they called me a liberal Republican, which I hadn't heard before, but at any rate, you're really talking about a very similar kind of thing in Johnson County. So we understand a lot more than a lot of people in the state might understand. But those communities of interest are important, but you're not going to be able to address every one of them in every district. And so I tend to be a little bit more of a square corner guy and draw the maps and look at population and population density as basically the guide that you need to look at, and then see what you're doing to those communities of interest once you've drawn them.
All right, thank you. I posted a little commentary in the chat if anyone's interested. In the meantime, we'll move on. This next question also relates to communities of interest. Under what circumstance or circumstances would the legislature divide any city or county or collapse a district?
Well, I've got a pretty strong opinion on that. I think the only reason that you should divide any city or county is if they're too large for them to be one district. I think it should be depending upon size and population. And if you get beyond that, you run the risk of actually being accused by some community of interest of being anti that community, whatever it happens to be, or of trying to gerrymander around some community of interest. If you do it by numbers, it's pretty hard to argue about numbers. And if you do it with more of a consistent type of activity, such as a city or a county, then I think it's harder to argue about that being a gerrymandered process.
So I would say that no, unless the city won't fit all in one legislative district, as is the case with Overland Park, right? I represent Overland Park, east of Metcalf and south of 79th Street for the most part, and then north of 435. Overland Park is the second largest city in Kansas, so obviously we're not going to be able to fit a House district in there. We might see some collapsing of districts just due to the population shift, right? So this is something that we're looking at for a lot of my rural Kansas colleagues. My legislative district has had an increase in population due to some housing development that has occurred here in the past 10 years. And so the size of the district that I represent, or at least the geographical size, not the population size, will have to decrease. And so we'll see that for a couple of our legislative districts in Johnson County, and we might see some collapsing entirely. Now, obviously, I can't help it. I know that I should be talking about congressional districts because I know that that's what interests everyone. But I am going to go ahead and make a plug for the Kansas legislature because we see a lot of what happens in Congress on TV, but what affects your lives daily the most is what happens in Topeka. And so that's why I'm focused the most on those maps. So I guess as we look more at the congressional maps, I do think, yes, it would be highly problematic to see Johnson County split. The only possible split that I could possibly reconcile would be if all of inside the 435 loop were at least kept together and outside the loop can, be part of a different district. But even then, I think that that's really problematic with the way that Johnson County is growing. And frankly, our economic interests are very similar.
All right, thank you. It's always good to hear a plug for state legislatures. Next questions reference fairness. How did or how will you determine whether a district or an entire state district plan is fair? Are the criteria you use different for a single district than for a statewide plan?
I don't know. This is kind of simple, but this is benchmark true north that I have tended to throughout. There's an old adage in politics: if you're explaining, you're losing. And so if I have to explain a map to you, and if it takes me, say, more than a couple of sentences, then yeah, it's probably, I know that I'm simplifying this, but if I have to spend a lot of time explaining to you why a map looks the way that it does, it's probably not a good map. So it's probably not very fair. So, that's sort of the initial baseline for that. And then, of course, it's, we have to make sure that they are following some of these standards for redistricting that we need to see. Is it a compact district? Does it include similar communities of interest? Is it a contiguous district? A lot of times, oh, geez, I can't believe I'm going to bring this phrase up, but, sometimes people will talk about, oh, what is pornography? And they say, I know it when I see it. Same goes with fair maps. I'm going to know a fair map when I see it, and I'm going to know an unfair map when I see it, because I've seen different examples, especially 10 years ago, to which Senator Owens could probably speak a little bit more than I could.
Well, I think transparency is the key here, and that's a word that is sometimes, I think, abused these days. But I think you have to have a very open view, and partisanship can really come into play and be a problem here. You know, the criteria should be the same, and it should be based on population, in my opinion. But you just have to be very careful about the partisanship aspect of it as to how people are going to view it. You know, you were talking about the different congressional districts. Well, you know, let's look at the one that there's one that has been discussed. I've seen it on television ads and seen it on various things, but you know, and I'm still a registered Republican, but you know, I'm not sure that the Republicans would necessarily claim that I fit very well there, but I don't think the Democrats would think I fit very well there either. So that's okay. But I think that what we are really looking at is that with the 3rd congressional district, which is where we live in Johnson County, you have to ask yourself if you're not transparent and you have people that are looking at shifting that district, cutting Johnson County in half, cutting Wyandotte County in half. Are you really trying to shift it based upon political partisanship? Probably so. And anybody who doesn't think that probably, you know, is a little naive. But I think that it's going to be a mistake if they try to split those 2 counties. And if they do, they need to be really transparent as to why they're doing it. And if that means they have to say, well, we want a Republican elected instead of a Democrat who's there, the only Democrat of the 4, then, you know, I think that's gonna be a big difference. I think one of the concerns I have, I don't know most of the people. I maybe only know one of the people on the committees, but this is a place, I didn't know where I was going to raise this issue, but if the chair of the committee is going to be running against the person who is seated in the 3rd district, I got a little problem with that as maybe a conflict of interest. If in fact they split the 3rd district in order to give that chairperson an advantage. And I think that that's something that needs to be looked at, and that's that transparency question. I don't care what party we're talking about, but they should be very open about it. And you know, I think that that's something that ought to be considered by the commission, and they ought to be looking at who should be maybe withdrawing from some considerations because of that.
Senator Owens must have anticipated the next question. So let's get right to it. Panelists, how do you defend against those who claim that allowing state legislators to draw the lines in redistricting is somewhat like letting the fox guard the hen house?
Well, I know I just got finished talking, but I'll answer this real quickly, and if that's all right with you, Representative Clayton. The answer that you hear most of the time when that question is raised is the people elect the legislature. And they elect them with the idea that they're supposed to guard the hen house in many ways. Now, as I said before, it could be naive to think that they're going to do it in a way that isn't purely political, because most of the time it probably is, but not always. And so I think a lot of people would answer that question, and especially the people in the majority, no matter which majority it might be, but the people in the majority would say, hey, we were elected by the people, and the people are telling us they want us to protect them from any of these different things, including how the maps might be drawn. And I've heard that before, and I heard it from some of the places that we went to 10 years ago when we went around the state. So I think that's one of the approaches that I think people would take in answering that question.
Well, it's funny because this question is something, you know, honestly, I have said this for years in my legislative forums, almost verbatim, that that there is no such thing as an unbiased legislator, and that we all, whether we admit it or not, know exactly what we want our districts to look like because we know the precincts where we did well in. And that's the number one reason why we shouldn't be drawing those maps, because bias is impossible to remove. And I have used that fox guarding the chicken coop argument. And oh, look, here I am on the redistricting committee. So now I find myself in a very unique position because here I am, I've been saying this for years, and now I'm a member of this committee. And so it's one of those things where as I enter into this and as we begin, hopefully soon, our work on this, it's again going to require a lot of heavy lifting on my part to make sure that I really am being as fair as possible. So I think that the onus is on the legislators to make sure that they are doing the right thing. Although it's interesting, I think that if I asked a lot of my constituents in private conversations how they want the maps to look and what they want me to do, I don't know if they want me to draw something that's fair or if they want me to draw something that kind of helps us and our values win a little bit more in Topeka. So I should probably go ahead and send out a survey and see what everyone actually wants, just from a secret, quiet answer sort of thing, where no one but me really sees that. Because right now I'm going into this thinking about the moral implications and understanding that it needs to be fair. But as a representative, it is incumbent upon me to bring the people that I represent what they actually want.
All right, thank you very much for those thorough answers to probably one of the most perennial questions about redistricting in Kansas you could get. I want to add my own preface to the next question, just very briefly, and just remind everyone that in 2010, after the 2010 census, the state of Kansas was not able to agree on a map through the legislature, and the maps were drawn by the federal courts. This meant that Kansas was the last state in America to have its new congressional districts. So California's 53 congressional districts drawn by citizens commissions were completed sooner than Kansas's 4. So I just couldn't resist throwing that little backstory in there. Now here's the question. If the maps are not drawn and approved early in the legislative session, it impacts the filing deadline. How might that impact the 2022 election?
Well, let's see. The first time I had the opportunity to win an election was in the 2012 elections when we, the filing deadline, I believe, Senator, right, wasn't it originally June 1st and then it got moved due to the delay? And so I very distinctly remember we found out what the maps looked like at around 11:30 on Thursday night, and the filing deadline was that following Monday by noon. So it was a somewhat truncated primary process and just a breakneck speed kind of election. So that's kind of what I imagine it would look like. And it all kind of depends on how well we are able to get along and be adults. So that's my take on it.
Well, it's a significant issue, and obviously I went through one, but it really depends upon, or it affects who the candidates may be, because there may be people who want to run, but because they don't know what their district is going to be, and then time drags on, and then it gets very close, and they just decide not to do it. We might have good people lost, or maybe people that shouldn't be there drop out. But I think it really affects who the candidates are many times. And since you brought up that point, Dr. Smith, about the session ending in the courts, I can personally attest to what that was like, and that I spent 3 hours on the stand in the district court, U.S. District Court, when the judges had to take over when we couldn't draw maps. And we had 36 lawyers representing different interests in the court. And that was an interesting experience for me as an attorney to be a witness on a stand and questioned by almost 36. I don't know that they all asked the questions, but it certainly became an issue that because the courts had to draw it, because it drew out a long time, that when they drew the maps were different than any that I had seen. And some of them were close, but to give you an example, in my own case, I lost 60% of my district at the time in that redrawing of the district, which was significant in an election. So that's the sort of thing that can happen. And I just wanted to throw that in and respond to your comment, but I appreciate your comment.
All right, we're down to our final 3 questions. Remember that you may ask a question as well, because we have so many people in this meeting. We'd ask that you type it into the chat. I've got my chat box open and I can see it. There's some activity there right now. We're happy to ask those, but let's move on and get into some specifics about redistricting, starting with Kansans who are incarcerated. The question is, what would it take to adjust census figures to include prisoners in their home locations?
Well, I think it would be significant first of all, you'd have to determine where their home district was, what they declared to be their home district. And we have many prisoners from outside the state. So are you going to have issues from people in different parts of the country and having to deal with other states' issues on that same issue? Or are you just going to limit it to Kansas residents who happen to be incarcerated and go with it from that perspective? But I'm not sure. I'll have to defer to you, Dr. Smith, on this. I haven't looked it up. And so the question I would have is, would it need a constitutional amendment in the state constitution? And I think it would.
I am of the similar opinion that it would need some sort of constitutional amendment. And again, issues with out-of-state prisoners and how we logistically look at that. And then how do we determine where the home district is? Is it their last known address? Is it the address that they claim? How does that look? And how is that defined? So we would have to make sure that we defined it, I believe.
Well, you two both know more than me. I hadn't thought to review the state constitution, but it's a great question and maybe we'll keep talking about it. Now on the next question, I'm sure you two have heard that the census count announcements may be delayed and we may get partial counts. And so the panel would like to know, how do we compensate for a lack of a complete count in the census?
Well, I wasn't sure exactly what that question meant, and we had been given some idea about what some of the questions would be, but my response on that to asking myself that question was, well, it depends upon the reason for it having been done. And it may be that that is the sort of thing that would require some kind of court intervention at some point.
Yeah, I would agree. Sorry, I was looking at my redistricting law book to see if I could pull up something on prison populations, but I don't see anything right away in the indices. But in any case, I think regarding our census numbers, we don't have all of the, the complete exhaustive data. We won't have that until the fall. But we also have a lot of other data that we can currently look at. I'm already working on preliminary maps based on some of the data that we have that might not be the official census data, but with some of the others before. So I think that we do have a fair amount to work with now. And again, I think that we can do a lot of work on the back end before we actually start getting the actual numbers.
So let me just clarify, Representative Clayton, and then I'll ask the last question from the panel. Are you saying that the process could start even with partial census data?
Not the formal process exactly, but we do have, at least we have some of the information. We know, for instance, that we will not be losing any of our congressional seats. So we've got that. So we know at least that little bit that we do know. So we can at least start going with that. We know we got 4. So we can start doing that at least.
Yes, that's true. Final question from the working group. What is the timeline for redistricting activities, including public comment for the 2021-2022 round?
If only we knew. Now, I can say that at least the House has convened our legislative redistricting committee. We have not seen what the Senate committee looks like, if they'll use their judiciary committee. Oh, yikes. That might not be for the best. Sorry to insert my opinion on the Senate matters, but you know, it just comes out sometimes, guys. But in any case, so the House redistricting committee has been set. And I do feel that, you know, we should at least start some of those preliminary meetings. And so I have a fairly good working relationship with both the chair and the vice chair, and especially our ranking minority member. That's Representative Tom Burrows from Wyandotte County. And this is not his first rodeo. So we will have very good representation as far as that's concerned. But I do think that we will at least have some sort of a preliminary meeting, probably after sine die, my guest and sine die is currently set at mid-May, as long as we have a reasonable length for a legislative session.
You know, once in a while you run into a question where you just have to answer, I don't know, because I haven't seen any of the figures come out or any of the dates or projections. So it's not something that, unless you're intimately involved, or you're going to really know the answer to that at this point. So I'm not going to venture any kind of a guesstimate.
All right, those are all the questions from the working group. We do have a few popping up in chat. One of them we've already been discussing. I'll go ahead and ask the panel. What is the process for recording where college students live?
All right, well, it's my understanding that college students' place of residence is where they register and where they claim to. I was an early absentee voter. My first election that I voted in would have been the 1996 primary, and while I was a student at the I voted in my home district of then Shawnee, Kansas, because that's where my folks lived. And I understood the, the political underpinnings of that area. So, and so at least I know based on my own experience, and I have several college students in my legislative district that do vote at home via absentee ballot.
I think that's the way I would respond as well. I don't know much more than that as far as any changes that have come about. I haven't heard of any. But I think that's the way it's still established.
And that's my understanding as well. Next question really gets into the specifics. What mapping software is the Kansas legislature using for the mapping work?
I don't know what everyone else is using, but I'm using something called Maptitude, Maptitude, like a portmanteau of map and attitude. So it seems, it's fairly easy to use and has a lot of different layered data into it, because again, this is a very complicated issue. So you have to make sure that you're on top of it.
I'm going to sound like a really old guy now, because what we did was we'd go to legislative research, and they had 2 or 3 really very smart people with the computer at that time. And I think, as I recall, by the time they finished, they drew 36 maps on their computer system that they had there. And it wasn't something that we did independently, at least I didn't. I went down and talked to them, and I would draw maps with the assistance of Mr. Carnahan or Mr. Callahan, and felt very comfortable with that.
I also wanted to add for the audience, if you're interested in drawing districts, I highly recommend a free app called Dave's Redistricting. It was created a decade or so ago by a former Microsoft engineer. It's entirely free. And if you want to draw your own districts and submit them, or just look at what districting looks like, the different demographics and how moving a line here means the demographics shift over there on the other end of the district. Dave's redistricting is really great. I've used it in class before. It's completely free. And for us political nerds, and you wouldn't be here if you weren't one, it's a lot of fun. So I wanted to throw that in. I also think as moderator, I should get to ask at least one question of my own. And I'm going to do that right now. As some of you may know, I study both Missouri and Kansas politics, and both of you live in Johnson County, which is on the border with Missouri and shares a metro area with it. The redistricting processes in Missouri is completely different. It uses a bipartisan commission. The commission has to agree, at least in the majority. And a few years ago, there was a ballot initiative that shifted it to districts proposed by a demographer, which would be drawn to maximize political competitiveness between the two parties. That was narrowly repealed by another initiative, which put the process back with the bipartisan commission. So looking at a neighboring state, just a few miles, maybe a few blocks from your homes, which has which does use a bipartisan commission and which briefly was going to experiment with a state-appointed demographer and a mandate to maximize competitiveness. How do you think that compares to the process used in Kansas, where it's all done by the state legislature?
Well, I think it sounds like certainly workable, but it still gets to the question of partisanship. And, you get down, the question I have just listening to your question is, who appoints the demographer?
It would be the state auditor, which is a partisan elected position.
Yes, rest my case.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of, I saw a question pop up in the chat. Why can't legislators just have, maps drawn by legislative research? Well, I'll tell you that I've looked at some of the staff that have been put on the House Redistricting Committee, and I know that one of those revisers of statutes is incredibly biased towards conservatives. And, while he's a fine person, I also know that anything that he drew would not be something that would represent my constituents. So right there, it's, if only there was such a thing as no bias, but there isn't. And so that's one of the problems.
Well, I would think that one of the last things that anybody in that kind of a position would want would be to be given that responsibility and therefore the recipient of the blame. So, I wouldn't want to be there if I was in a employed position within the state.
Yeah, it's kind of a sword of Damocles situation, right? So.
Let me follow up briefly on my question, and then some more activity is popping up on the chat. But on the other states, and it's not just Missouri, what's your first reaction to the states, which Missouri is one, Iowa is another, that use bipartisan commissions with an equal number of representatives from each party and require a supermajority to approve the maps? What's your first reaction to that?
I mean, it's probably still better than what we do. To say that it's perfect and perfectly unbiased, I think that both Senator Owens and I agree that there is no such thing as a completely objective, bias-free system. Now, what's funny is that my husband is in IT, and he said, oh, let's just have robots draw the maps. Also, no, because if you look, even these data-driven robots learn how to, it's awful, they learn how to be racist and do those things. So even AI ends up having bias. And so that's why we kind of, run into this issue where, do we have better systems available that is better than what we have currently with the partisan system in Kansas? Oh yeah. Are those systems perfect and free of bias? No.
I guess my reaction, my initial sense when you asked the question was, we're going to end up in court, because how difficult is it when you've got a equal number of people in both parties on a commission like that, and then you're supposed to have a super majority. We've seen in the US Congress lately how difficult it is to get to any kind of super majority, no matter who's in the White House or who's in either of the houses. But I would say that it'd be nice if it worked, and it might be worth trying. It can't be any worse than some of the things we've seen, but I still think it's another thing that we could look at the courts entering and into the process and drawing the maps.
Indeed, and there are states that use commissions that have found themselves in court. It's true. One of the questions was about using computer applications and algorithms to draw maps. I think you all already addressed that. Here's another one. Can self-made maps, such as those created by Dave's redistricting, be submitted to the powers that be, such as the members of the redistricting committees?
Can they be submitted by individuals? Is that the question?
Could constituents propose their own maps?
I think so. I think we had constituents when we'd go to the different places when we had the meetings who actually had maps that they would propose. Now, whether they rose to the level of the 36 that we ended up with before we couldn't reach an agreement on any one of them, I can't remember whether there were any of the constituents that drew them, but I think it's certainly something that can be presented. If nothing else, the constituent can present them through their legislator or senator, whoever they want to, and get them through that process, even if they couldn't send them directly.
Yeah, I agree. I have some concerns that I might get inundated with a lot of maps, and then perhaps a constituent might say, hey, why didn't my map get a hearing, and so on and so forth. But beyond that concern that there might just be too many that are being sent, I certainly see no issue with that. It's no different than providing input on any other policy.
Quick clarification on that. If citizens do submit their own maps, do they have to go to the Legislative Research Department first for review?
As I recall, I would think they would. They would have to be included in all of the maps that are presented and reviewed there, but that doesn't mean they couldn't present them.
Okay, good deal. Let me throw in another one of my own, and then we'll see if there are any final questions. Just a little bit more history. Going back to the 2010 cycle again, as I recall, and I followed that pretty closely as a professor and newspaper columnist, that issue really came down to Manhattan and Riley County. And the issue, at least according to the political rumor mill, now you're not going to see this in writing in any of the legislative notes, but the political rumor mill said that issue was that there was tremendous resistance to moving Manhattan into the big first district represented by Tim Huelskamp, which needed to happen, most people argued, unless you have extreme gerrymandering, in order to rebalance, because the big first district tends to lose population due to people moving out of rural areas. But Tim Huelskamp was a Tea Party firebrand who didn't have a lot of power in the House. And Manhattan is the home of K-State, part of Fort Riley, and the new NBAF Research Center, which hadn't been opened yet at that time. And there was a strong push to keep it represented by Representative Lynn Jenkins of the 2nd District. And essentially, the state legislature, majority Republican in both houses, deadlocked because the obvious solution to map makers was to move Manhattan into the 1st District, but there was tremendous resistance to doing that. Neither of those two elected officials are still in office, by the way. One was defeated and one retired. But here's my question. Let's get real. Don't we have to take political considerations like that into account when drawing districts?
Absolutely. And your recollection is extremely good. That was a huge issue for us to deal with. And, it was part of the reason why there wasn't an agreement. Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, I mean, from one standpoint, yes, we do need to take politics into consideration, but it's also worth noting that, yes, Congresswoman Jenkins retired, and Congressman Huelskamp was defeated in a primary. But now my email inbox is full of Trumpers telling me to disallow NBAF because it's gonna, cause a Wuhan lab. Yeah, legit. That's a thing that is happening now. Which, even Huelskamp, who, he seems normal now in comparison to the individual that defeated him in the primary and is now unfortunately our senator. So I think one thing that we do need to look at is that today's political expediency can be completely irrelevant tomorrow, or completely irrelevant, especially 10 years from now, because today's perfectly normal politician ends up being, otherwise. Never thought I'd say that I miss Huelskamp, but yet here we are. It's a strange world we live in.
I don't think I can add anything except it's a strange world we live in. Yes, it's different than 10 years ago, and it'll be different 10 years from now, probably.
What can you say about a Tea Party firebrand that spent more time on MSNBC than Fox News? Interesting man. All right. I don't see, let's see. Oh, nope, there is a new question, and I'm going to ask it. The question is, what would it take to have an independent commission in Kansas? Any chance of this change taking place before this redistricting?
I do not think so, because what needs to happen is that we need to have constitutional change. So first, we need to get a hearing, which we have not had. Then that bill needs to pass out of what I presume would be the Elections Committee. The House Elections Committee chairman, I think it's safe to say, is fairly hostile to this sort of a change. And then it would need to pass the entire House. And I'm not saying just a simple majority of 63. We'd need to get a constitutional majority of 84. Then it has to go through the Senate process, in which it would need to get 27 votes after going through that committee. Then it needs to go on the ballot. Now, we can't get it through on the ballot this year unless it was on for, say, a special election in January. And redistricting we have to have done, theoretically by June of next year. So there simply is not time. Now, I'm not going to say that this is entirely a bad thing, even though I agree with having an independent redistricting commission, because it should always be very difficult to change our state constitution. That's why it's so hard. That's why you've got the 2/3 majorities in both chambers and then a simple majority of the vote of the people on the ballot. But it's just, I don't think that it's going to happen this time. And it is disappointing because it was not for lack of trying on the parts of many legislators, both Democrats and Republicans.
I think given the nature of our makeup of our legislature, I think the answer is no.
There's a new question that's popped up. It's rather broad, but it's also kind of a nice way to sum up our conversation tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and ask it with just a little bit more specificity. And here's the question. Bottom line, you two, what are the criteria that will be used to draw the new districts?
Well, bottom line, it'll be population, because each Senate district is supposed to be a certain population, each House district, and so on. So that is the first and foremost of all criteria. Not saying it's the only one, though, but that's where we're going to start.
Well, I think that's where it has to start. And the courts would require that it start there. Any other way would not be acceptable, I think, judicially. But I just think that it's going to have to start with that. But it's going to be strongly political. And with the makeup of our legislature, I think it's going to be very difficult to make any differences or changes from where it is now and where it's headed.
All right, thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I hope the other folks here have as well. I want to thank Senator Owens and Representative Clayton. We're just getting started, folks. We've got a lot more to come. As I posted in the chat, we don't even have final census numbers really until, my understanding is they're due in October. That doesn't give you a lot of time. There are a couple more questions popping up. Let's go ahead and ask this one last one. Could a statute require that legislative research draw the maps and the legislature vote them up and down? That'll be our final question.
It could. I don't think that we would get it voted through this quickly. We start our legislative veto session on Monday, and while we could, of course, pass such a hearing, such a bill through an exempt committee, most likely the Federal and State Affairs Committee, I just find it highly doubtful given all the other things that we need to take up. So a lot of this is, unless we called a special session, there's just not a lot of time in order to do that. And I don't even know if I would support such a statute, because which people in legislative research? Who hires those people in legislative research? How can we determine what their bias is? And legislative research, they're great people. They're good to rely on for information, but you know what? They are not accountable to the people the way that elected officials like me are. So if I draw a nasty map and champion that, you guys can throw me out of office, and you should. If someone from research does it, you can't do anything. They're an employee. So that's one thing we need to bear in mind.
I agree with that. And again, I'll say what I said before. I think I would be very uncomfortable as an employee of the state if I were asked to do that, knowing that it was going to be something that, okay, well, it wasn't my fault. It's legislative research did it. I wanted to make one comment before we leave that probably I'm the only one here can make this comment without repercussions. I'm really disappointed in one thing, in that, I appreciate Representative Clayton being here, and of course she's a member of the Democratic Party, and there are Democrats and Republicans. I'm a member of the Republican Party, but there are I was disappointed that none of the Republicans on the committees would agree to come on this program. And part of the reason I'm disappointed in that is because the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization. And I would think that certainly the Republican Party would want to be a part and be at the table. But apparently there are people who just do not want to address the issues that the League is addressing, which I think are good issues. But I guess not all Republicans think the same way. So I just wanted to point out that I'm disappointed that the Republican members of the committees were not willing to participate in this program.
Thank you, Senator Owens. That's a great note to end on. Thank you both for your genuine and very thoughtful answers to our questions. And Dr. Smith, you showed a perfect balance of being moderator and an additional source of facts and information as well. So can't imagine that we didn't have a more perfect, oh, your dog is getting ready to make some noise. Okay. Well, I think all of our stomachs are growling, so we probably need to move on and finish this up. We're just about done here. So, but thank you again. And thank you to everyone else for the questions that you had. And keep those in mind, because we'll be having future meetings and events where we can use some of those ideas. And it sounds to me like something on drawing maps would be of interest to folks. So I think that we might kind of try something like that. Trying to get I don't know what happened here.
Yeah, Teresa, it's showing. It just needs to go. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, sorry. All right, this was provided to me by one of our co-presidents. As you know, the legislature went on a break and left kind of a flurry of bills in their wake as they left. Governor Kelly has vetoed several of them, and we have some listed here that you may or may not be familiar with. The bill that discriminates against transgender Kansas girls and participating in sports in schools, requiring high schoolers to pass a civic test, even though this is taught in the schools, lowering the age to carry a concealed weapon, NRA's gun familiarity course for the schools to provide gun safety classes, a new idea for a license plate in Kansas. Might be some more here, let me see. Anyway, as Representative Clayton mentioned, both chambers of the legislature returned to work on Monday to tackle the vetoes, and they didn't get K-12 public education taken care of either. So we really want to implore you to reach out and ask them to ask the governor to and your legislature to leave the vetoes in place and instead work on passing a balanced budget that funds public education and invests in Kansas. And Medicaid expansion would also be a great thing to see for Kansas as well. If you want to find out, if you don't know already how to contact your representative or senator, the link is here that you can get on the Kansas legislature website and look those up. And anyway, are there any last questions that anyone has? Or I can't see anything in the chat right now. Does anybody have anything else before we close?
We're having a little side conversation about the Gadsden flag. That's the "Don't Tread on Me" one.
Yeah.
But I don't see any questions as such in the
Okay.
chat right now.
Yeah, if you have any questions, reach out to the league. Our website has a lot of great information on it, and we'll be happy to help you. Thank you all for your attendance. Big thanks again. I don't know how we do it. Maybe, hands up, air applause, something for the great panel and moderators. So thank you so much. Have a nice evening.